A young campus police officer walked into the shadows of a gymnasium and never came back. For nearly 2 decades, the mystery haunted the university. Whispers turned into legend, the kind of story that makes people lower their voices when they pass old buildings after dark. And then, 18 years later, workers renovating the bleachers stumbled upon something no one expected. His neatly folded shirt, badge still pinned, waiting under the wood as if it had been keeping a secret all this time. What happened to him? Why did the truth stay buried for so long? And what did the gymnasium's walls really witness that night? Austin, September 1993. Heat laid over the city like a slow-breathing animal, the kind that finds a patch of concrete and claims it until night comes, and the river smell rose early and honest, damp and a little metallic, as if pennies had been melted somewhere upstream, while under the Congress Avenue Bridge, the bats stitched their black cursive into the violet dusk and streetlights blinked on one by one like a shy choir. The campus spread its red brick ribs and green lawns and humming vents and murmuring libraries and called itself alive. An organism with long hallways for arteries and doors that sighed each time a student tried and failed and tried again to become a new person by Friday. He walked inside that living body as if he belonged to its pulse. 24 years old and already the kind of listener who knew the color of a room by its echo. Caleb Monroe, campus police, uniform pressed so clean. It looked taut rather than sewn, the badge bright as a promise he kept to himself. And in his left breast pocket, a little graph paper notebook where he wrote the world in square-edged lines, oddities and timings and license plates that felt slightly out of tune. And in his duty belt, a pen that clicked only once because twice was superstition. And on his tongue, a low whistle he let out when worry scratched, 2 soft notes that tasted of breath mints and patience. He had been raised by a librarian who taught him the quiet alphabet of order spines even, drawers labeled, facts shelved next to mercy, and by corridors where his father, who once fixed what broke and left the rest to grace, walked with a ring of keys so heavy it wrote its own small weather and sound. That is why Caleb, grown and in a blue shirt, labeled everything with red tape, a neat stripe and a date, because putting a name on a thing was a way to touch it without bruising. There were people threaded through his days, like good stitches. Sienna Duarte at the Bats and Beans, with ink on her fingers from tallying tips and a habit of writing tiny messages on the inside of matchbooks. You forgot your smile. Coffee on me next time. Don't trust the weather so light a hand that the letters looked like feathers pressed into paper. June Park, who wrote for the student paper and carried a camera that spit Polaroids she labeled in a neat print, dates and temperatures and the smell if it was strong enough to deserve the honor. Rory Maddox for maintenance, with varnish in his fingerprints and a molasses voice, who called every bolt by its first name and moved with the soft clatter of a keyring heavy enough to chime when he turned. Coach Thomas Reed, assistant and always almost in charge, whose coin slid and danced across his knuckles whenever words came too straight and needed a curve. And Dominic Holley, fraternity golden boy, hair so carefully arranged it seemed copyrighted, who clapped backs and called strangers buddy, and made even his lies sound like invitations to a better afternoon. By late September the campus had learned the blessing of shade, and at night the Pecan Grove gym lit up like a lantern with ribbed sides, bleachers smelling of old resin, sweat sweetened by popcorn, floor polished to a mild, forgiving shine. An intramural game filled the ribs of the building with foot thumps and the heightened laughter of victory rehearsed too soon. And there was a song of wood inside the wood, a hollow hymn that traveled beam to beam whenever bodies rose and fell together, as if the gym were a friendly instrument and the students were its practiced hands. Caleb walked the outer ring, checked exits, nodded to Rory, who crouched with a socket wrench, traded a look with June, who framed a shot and hid a smile, lifted 2 fingers toward Sienna in the doorway with a thermos she swore tasted like rain, and paused just long enough to tilt his head. He knew this building. He could tell when it inhaled and when it held its breath. At the east bleachers, lower tier, row 17, seat B, A different tone answered his boot heel. He opened the graph paper notebook and wrote, quick and square, 17B, hollow sound, check. The scoreboard wound down and the air changed. That soft after-storm feeling when bodies leave and noise remains a few steps behind, trees outside. Shaking off the evening like old dogs shaking off the lake, echoes walking the aisles without permission. Caleb heard the radio crackle, heat singing in its static, and a dispatcher's voice that did not yet know it was about to become a memory, anomalous noise under east bleachers. A small call, the kind that lives at the edge of a shift, and rarely grows teeth. He looked toward the far door where Sienna balanced 2 paper cups and mouthed later. He nodded. Then he found the maintenance hatch Rory always said was 3 screws closer to the floor than anyone guessed. Unsnapped the grate and went down into air that felt cooler by 1 careful degree. Into a service corridor where dust floated like quiet snow and the wood smell thinned into old glue and iron. The campus kept breathing. Bodies poured out to the parking lot. The last whistle folded into laughter. The night got friendlier. Rory wiped his hands on a cloth and pocketed a useless screw because it had disappointed him, and he believed in second chances even for hardware. Dominic performed the end of a joke with arms wide and received applause he had not earned. Reed drifted toward a phone on the office wall and spun his coin once, twice, a third time, the silver flashing its private moonlight. June slid a Polaroid from the camera, inked on the white border, Pecan Grove after game, air still, wood louder, and waited for the image to crawl up from its own fog. Down below, where light fell in torn strips, Caleb's footsteps learned. A new rhythm, careful over pipes and squared beams, shoulders brushing old paint, the whistle in his throat soft as if he didn't want to wake the architecture. He tapped with a knuckle, mapped the change in tone, listened with the palm like a stethoscope made of skin. The east bleachers had a place where the plank met the support at a disagreeing angle, where someone's caution had been postponed a week too long. He raised the radio, said his name, said his location, said he was going to take a look. The reply came with the lazy patience of machines. Copy. After that, the night split like a page that had been creased too many times. A patrol car would sit with its engine cooling in the lot, hood reflecting the first dry stars. A pen would roll under the seat and stop in the narrow country where small things live for years, and the radio would call his last name with the tenderness of a person trying to wake someone who has fallen asleep in a chair. Monroe, status check. In the gym, the bleachers finished emptying, and the last joke was told twice to make sure it landed. And the floor kept its shine because it had learned to be proud. What the campus knows, it holds. What it loses, it whispers. In the days that followed, whispers learned to organize themselves into searches, the kind with maps on hoods and markers in the hands of men who hated feeling useless. Posters went up on telephone poles with tape that curled in the afternoon heat. A helicopter drummed the air and turned the city into a diagram. There were rooms with too much air conditioning and not enough oxygen where people sat at tables and called this meeting and the next and measured the distance between phrases like, "we hope" and "we don't know." June turned a wall of cork into a topography of absence, the Polaroids buttoned down with pushpins, arrows and times and coffee stains that behaved like coordinates. Sienna placed a stack of matchbooks in a drawer and closed it gently, as if the matches could burn through wood and bring him back. Rory oiled hinges no one noticed and stood too long in doorways listening to metal explain itself. Reed polished shoes and practiced statements in a mirror. Dominic told the story of the last high five as if stories could be bricked together to make a shelter, and yet even with the city wide awake, there was a smaller, truer version of that night that did not move, a room the size of a breath where time shook its head and refused to pass. It is the version that lives after the game, when the scoreboard has gone dark and the gym has cooled a single degree. When dust hangs in the wake of nothing, when the east bleachers are empty, and a slow wooden respiration moves through them. Like an old animal sleeping when the radio, stubborn and hopeful and already a little afraid, lifts its voice into the quiet once more and says, "Monroe." Respond, and then says it again, softer. "Monroe, respond." And then, having offered every syllable it owns, falls still and lets the building keep breathing without him, the sound folding into a silence that learns the shape of his name and will not forget it. August 3rd, 2011, the kind of morning that turns metal warm to the touch before noon, and the gym that once held 1,000 small victories breathed out a tired smell of varnish and dust while men in orange vests unbuttoned the east bleachers plank by plank. A foreman ran his palm along a board and said, "This one has a memory." And the younger worker laughed until the pry bar bit and the board lifted and the air under it changed, cooler by a degree and carrying a sweetness not meant for morning popcorn. Sweat, a cedar hint. Something soft showed in the gap, a color that once had the confidence of sky dot. It was a shirt, folded with the dignity of a kept promise. Blue gone to gray at the seams, and the badge was still pinned above the left pocket, as if the heart beneath. It had never stopped planning to return. Gloves that had been busy became careful. A plastic bin appeared as though fetched by the air itself. When the pocket was eased open with tweezers that knew how to move slowly, 2 small things came up. A cream matchbook from the Bats and Beans, edges furry with years, and on its flap a sentence in blue ink, 17B sings. And behind it a faded ticket, stub stamped with the date from long ago and 2 initials, SD, written with a hand that liked its S to stand taller than its D. By noon, a chain of calls had carried the finding from the gym floor to a conference room where voices remembered how to be reverent. Doors opened for footsteps that were not sure yet which decade they belonged to. That was how Detective Lila Serrano arrived. Cold cases, warm eyes, a measured posture, and a thermos whose lid, when she turned it, let loose the soft breath of cinnamon. She poured coffee into a paper cup and held it like a candle, and she looked at the shirt like a sentence missing its verb. Her humor, when it showed, came dry and brief. "We do not hurry the dead," she said, and the workers who had been telling each other the time of day stopped needing their watches. Word found Sienna Duarte at a small table near the front window of the cafe. She came because the matchbook had come. In the gym she looked smaller than memory allows, but her eyes was still the color of rain, undecided. Lila slid the stub into a sleeve of clear plastic and turned it until the light met the pencil. Sienna breathed once and said, "That's mine. I make my S too tall when I'm in a hurry." June Park came too, carrying a banker's box, Polaroids, clippings, notes on index cards. She set the box on a table and opened the lid. The shirt went to a table layered with clean paper. A tech walked a soft brush along the seams, a slow snowfall of dust into a waiting tray. Lila leaned close and watched glitterless grains gather. When the tray tilted, the light caught tiny sugar-bright flexi-poxy turned crystalline by age, the kind of glue used under bleachers where wood meets strain. Someone said the word softly. Lila did not nod. She filed the fact in that careful ledger some people keep behind their eyes. A rolling whiteboard arrived. Lila drew 3 modest boxes because she didn't like the vanity of webs. Maintenance went in the first, and under it the name Rory Maddox, a man whose keys sang before he turned a corner. Athletics went in the second, and beneath it Coach Thomas Reed, whose signature had a habit of arriving on purchase orders like a wind that changed direction. Student leadership went in the third, and she wrote Dominic Hawley, not because charm is a crime, but because charm often knows the hallway where crimes pass. Around them she sketched no arrows yet, only edges. Maps came out, crawl spaces sketched in shy lines, and Rory's old notes were requested. The carpenter who had touched the plank first was asked to show exactly where his hand had felt the temperature drop. June opened a folder and laid down the mural of absence from 1993, rebuilt in miniature photos. Times, a tracing of the gym with the east bleachers shaded like a bruise. She added a new card, matchbook, 17B sings. Sienna stood with fingers pressed to the sleeve that held the stub and did not cry, because crying would have made the stub about her. And this was about a man who had memorized her face and then gone down into a place where faces do not follow. The campus woke up in a way that made cicadas pause. Rumor remembered its scales. A librarian pulled a long-forgotten flyer from a drawer. A custodian paused in a stairwell and closed his eyes. A former roommate wrote to an address that might still work and used the word remember twice in the first line. Hope took a seat in the bleachers and waited. Inside the gym the air cooled, because attention had become exact. The shirt lay beneath a light that kept nothing secret. The badge had scratches. Lila invited a handful of people to stand in a slow half-circle. Sienna with her matchbooks, June with her box, a university official who had learned in the last hour how to be humble, and a young tech holding a clipboard the way a student might hold a question. Lila spoke. This is what we will do. The case is reopened. We will ask the epoxy to tell us which tree it met and when. We will ask the cloth to give up its pollens and its dust. We will count the fibers as if they were miles. We will look for tool marks in places where tools pretend not to have been. We will walk beneath the floor and name every hatch and hinge and crawl space until the building runs out of secrets. If silence answers, we will wait. Someone exhaled in relief. Outside, bats tested the evening like musicians tuning their strongest note. Inside, a box lined with cotton waited. Lila lifted the shirt, weightless the way certain heavinesses are, and set it respectfully inside. The seal hissed. She wrote the date in a clear hand and the time that belonged, for better or worse, to this renewed beginning. That afternoon the underfloor world earned its own map. Chalk lines marked hatches long unnamed, vents that hummed, a crawl space tracing row 17 like a vein. June repinned her corkboard and left a thumbtack where answers should sit. Sienna waited in the doorway with the matchbook. Lila marked a time to return after dusk and said that patience is a tool and would, when asked kindly, "We'll talk." The words seemed to step down the aisle and find the old wooden gap where air collects and stories wait. There, under the east bleachers, the small promise sank like a coin into water and kept going into the dark that listens and remembers and settled in the listening dark. Quietly, the gin seemed to hold breath as if listening back with patient woods. The day unrolled itself with the careful slowness of someone returning to a room they once loved and were not sure they deserved. And interviews began the way good repairs begin, from the squeak that will not hush. Rory Maddox came first, smelling faintly of lemon oil and old dust, the heft of keys at his hip making a quiet chiming that sounded like a pocket full of late afternoons. His hands had the small tremor of men who have turned too many screws that did not want to be convinced. And when Lila asked about that night in '93, he nodded as if answering a long prayer. Said my girl was burning up and the hospital lights made every minute taller. And he brought out of a creased envelope a paper that had kept its stubborn ink, an emergency wristband, a billing stub with the date and an hour that refused to change. It's mine. He spoke of the gym the way a man speaks of a barn he knows by smell. There are spots that sing, he said, places where the wood keeps air tucked under it like a secret, and if you walk slow enough you can feel the song in your boot. He placed one wide palm on the table as if it were the rib of the building itself and tapped once, and everyone heard a phantom answer, even though the table was quiet. Coach Thomas Reed followed with a crease in his trousers, so sharp it could part a stream, voice clean and slightly polished as though every sentence had passed through a cloth. The coin in his right hand traveled from knuckle to knuckle, silver glinting like a small moon with too many phases. He said he left early that night. The game was routine, nothing unusual, and when Lila asked how early, he gazed at the ceiling, as if time might be written there where he alone could read it, and said 10:15 or perhaps 10:30. Memory is nebulous after so many seasons, and he let the word nebulous sit like a cushion between him and the hard chair. He added that repairs, if any, would have been tomorrow matters, not night work. The kind of thing one signs for after coffee. And he smiled the professional smile of a man who has memorized the angles of courtesy. Dominic Hawley arrived like weather. Through a doorway, grinned tight and bright, hair careful in a way that wanted applause. He said a thing no one had asked yet, that he had seen movement in the back corridor. 2 silhouettes pushing a cart that made a stubborn wheel cry out, and he puffed the story from small to medium until it filled the room with the smell of varnish and doubt. Then, delighted to be useful, he produced a VHS tape from the bar by the athletic fields, a night of clinking glasses and music too proud for the speakers, and there was a moment of lightness when the DJ missed the cue not once, not twice, but 3 whole times, apologizing into a microphone that squealed like a gull, while Dominic waved at the lens at 11:07, and then again at 11:19, as if all clocks had agreed to witness him. He looked around with the satisfied expression of a man who has just brought the dessert, and Lila wrote down the numbers without changing her face. June Park reopened what she had never closed in her heart. The student paper's archive smelled like old gum wrappers and ghosted perfume, like all the soft debris of years that refused to sweep themselves away. She slid open boxes, fed microfilm to a hungry machine, and unrolled a bundle of her own notes tied with string. There, in a thin reporter's notebook, was the sentence she had written with a hand that shook enough to slant the letters, hollow under 17B, and the page held a faint print of sweat as if the heat of that night still remembered her. She laid this on the table beside a Polaroid whose colors had been patient enough to stay. The east bleachers a layered shadow that now felt like a diagram of a throat. The epoxy came forward like a shy suspect who cannot help being noticed. Procurement logs wandered in, photocopied in gray, edges chewed by office machines that had served too long. Here was a request for 2 gallons of 2-part marine epoxy, rush delivery, notation, urgent repair, east bleachers, and below a scrawl. That could be anybody's, and also a very particular somebody's. Another slip mentioned replacement boards and before 0700, and the ink had the hurried look of a pen being dragged by nerves. The words did not accuse yet, they merely gathered like birds on a wire, and the wire belonged to the morning after a night no one could remember in straight lines. Sienna stood by the window with the light, making her hair the color of old wheat, and told the room about the last long talk. How he had leaned across the counter with elbows careful not to touch the sugar and said, "If wood sings it is because it keeps air trapped like a small winter," and he had smiled a little at his own poetry, and she had given him a matchbook because that was the currency of kindness then, and he had promised to check the sound under the east side after the game. A promise light as paper and heavy as a stone in a pocket. She said it without breaking, because breaking would have made their minutes about grief, and she wanted them about truth. As the hours filled with statements, the times began to fight one another the way brothers do after the funeral, everyone certain they are right, because being wrong would require rearranging the furniture of memory. The scoreboard had said one thing at the buzzer. The security camera on the south entrance recorded another, a slow second hand that lagged like a tired runner. The payphone by the vending machines stamped its calls with a clock that had been 5 minutes fast since the last storm, and no one had ever cared enough to fix. Coach Reed's wristwatch apparently lived in a world of its own where quarters ended early, and early meant everything. Lila wrote the times in 2 neat columns, then a third, then drew a soft bracket around all of them as if to say we will hold them together until they learn to agree. A tech from facilities stepped close, with a small clear bag that had been living for years under dust. Inside, a bent key ring, the tag scuffed but legible, MDX. The rumor did not walk. It ran, MDX becomes Maddox if you tilt your head and hurry, and by late afternoon, the whisper had done a lap of the campus and put its hands on its knees to breathe, while faces turned toward Rory as if letters were verdicts. He took the bag in his palm and shook his head, slow and stubborn, said MDX, sounds like a key blank model to me. And the tech shrugged the shrug of people who are new to old mysteries, and like the way coincidence tastes on the tongue. Lila did not allow the rumor to plant itself. She pinned the bag to a board with a label that did not accuse, only described, ring recovered, tag MDX, origin unknown, and she underlined unknown because that is a word that keeps company with patience. That day had its own tide sphere rising, then receding, indignation splashing at the ankles of the wrong man. A brief, absurd laugh when Dominic replayed the DJ's third mistake, and someone clapped purely for bravery. The hush that came whenever the shirt was mentioned and the badge was seen in the mind where a badge shines cleanest. Through these movements, Lila kept the rhythm of someone sanding a rough edge, steady, even, sure that a surface can learn gentleness. She spoke little, but when she did the words fit each other, like proper joinery. "We will not chase shadows," she said. "We will ask the wood to tell us where it held breath and why." When the light outside turned the color of aspirin, June pinned her old note at eye level hollow under 17B, and the room aligned itself around it the way a compass aligns, even when the hand holding it shakes. The map of the underfloor passages lay open like veins sketched in chalk, and the smell of old resin seemed to thicken, whether imagined or real no one asked, because believing the nose is sometimes how a story learns to move. Sienna closed her eyes and touched the edge of the matchbook sleeve, a habit now, as if smoothing a wrinkle in time. Rory wrapped a piece of string around the key bag as if giving it a temporary leash. Reed folded his hands so the coin would rest, then let it roll again. Dominic tried out silence and discovered it fit him poorly. Lila looked over everything: papers, faces, the thin dust that transforms light into visible weather, and made the decision that had been growing quietly since morning. She pulled a take-contain small notebook from her jacket, wrote a line that made the page seem steadier, and spoke in a tone that carried both invitation and rule. "Midnight," she said. "Minimal light. We will listen to the wood." Midnight came back like a tide that had been promised, slow and cool, and a degree gentler than the day, and the gym answered with a thin electric hum that never learned to sleep. Lights held low and colorless as if the building were saving its truest shades for when no one was watching. Footsteps finding their own careful echo as if the floor remembered every gain and would not let any step go alone. Breath gathered and was measured, the way breath is measured in hospital corridors and in churches after the hymn. And the east bleachers waited with the patience of old ribs, wood on wood, iron on wood, the whole thing a friendly creature that had once known cheering and now knew listening. They went under. Lila first, because some people are built to go first and make it look like courtesy. Rory behind her with the keys speaking soft metal syllables against his leg. June with a narrow beam held low. Sienna at the edge of the hatch with a hand on the frame as if she could steady the entire building by loving it enough, and then evidence. Tech who had the good manners of silence. The air under there had the coolness of a cellar and the clean bitterness of dust that has decided to be honest. The beam swept sideways, and the light did what side light does. It pulled texture forward, made the surfaces show their history like scars against skin. The 17B line took form, not a number, but a region in the wood where a seam had been taught impatience, and a bait dot there were cicatrices of resin there. Pale ribbons hardened to a low shine as if someone had tried to retell the story of the grain, but in another language, a language of hurry. June crouched and let the beam skate along the seam. The dust lifted in a slow silvery weather and settled again on her shoes. Lila touched nothing, but her eyes touched everything. She named the pieces in a whisper that was not for anyone: plank, brace, lag bolt, stain, hinge. Rory put 2 fingers on a support and the wood answered his skin with the quiet of long held breath. "You hear it," he said, and the others did not, but they believed him, because belief is sometimes a kind of hearing. The first finding was a dark bloom at the edge of a brace. Brown, not red, the color iron makes when it has been trying to return to dirt for years. The swab came out of its sleeve and returned to it, A little story captured, labeled, sent ahead to another room. No one said the word blood because the wood had already said it in its slower tongue. A foot length away a small key ring waited. Bent as if some larger force had remembered it by accident, the tag scuffed, but still offering its poor certainty. Men DX. The rumor that had lived in daylight woke up in the dust. Rory felt it move toward him the way a draft moves under a door. He lifted the ring with gloved fingers and set it on a cloth, and the beam found a few inches of metal gouge in the nearby brace. Not a scratch, but a lever mark, the kind crowbars leave when they want to be believed. The shape of blame like straight lines. Keys belong to the man with keys. Resin belongs to the man who knows where to buy it. Stains belong to the last people who stayed. The room under the bleachers felt warmer by a breath, as if the wood itself resented the arithmetic. June's voice, when it came, was small on purpose so that the words would not grow teeth. MDX is a model code, she said. Model DX, a blank for cutting keys, not a person's mark. She said it like a teacher who loves her students even when they are grown. She said it as someone who has learned that facts, too, need kindness to do good work. The ring lost some of its accusation. The air unnodded. They backed out slowly, brought the cloth, the swab, the photographs in words, and went to a table set against the far wall where the gym kept the forms of measurement it trusted: clipboards, pencils, tape that never stuck right in damp. Lila unfolded a fax so old its black had turned to winter gray, the paper thin as a dry leaf. The 22nd of September 93, 6:32, it said at the top. And under it, a request blessed with the desperation of morning. 2-part epoxy, replacement boards, east bleachers urgent repair, and a line for a signature that had not learned modesty. The line belonged not to maintenance, but to athletics, and the initials that wrote it had the proud slant of a man who believes ink can change the direction of a story. On another sheet, a note in the margin read before 0700, a sentence that sweated anxiety into its own paper. Lila laid the pages side by side and let their dates and minutes face one another. The gym lights made the faxes look like brittle X-rays of a spine that had been braced without anesthesia. Someone swallowed. Perhaps it was the building. Coach Reed stood off to the right and moved his coin the way a nervous man moves air through a room. The metal crossing his fingers, vanishing, returning, leaving a fine track of light like a weak comet. He said the season was busy. Forms could be signed in advance. He liked to keep things efficient. He did not remember the hour. He did not remember that particular morning. He could not be held to the exactness of ink when memory had been sanded down by years of whistle blows and bus trips. The coin fell once. He picked it up as if it had embarrassed them both. The epoxy was not an idea any longer. It was a presence. Tiny grains had come off the shirt like frost that knows how to endure, and the seam under 17B wore hardened gloss where gloss should not be. The tech spoke quietly about mix ratios and cure times, about what a 2-part needs in order to become a single promise, about how set happens more quickly when fear is helping. You could do a lot between midnight and 6:30, he said, and nobody contradicted him, not even the hour, which has always been vain. They moved again beneath, this time slower than slow, and the beam found more tools: handwriting, a bite here, a pry there, a dent shallow enough to be humble, but sure enough to be true. Lila straightened and let the dust settle on her sleeves, and then asked Rory, in that voice of hers that carried neither favor nor charge, if he had ever signed for resin. He said no, not then, not after. That was above him. His domain was oil and wood and a little varnish bought with petty cash. His hands shook and then forgot to. There are moments when a hypothesis steps out of the dark, not like a villain, but like an usher with a candle, and this was one of them. They saw it together without quite saying it. Someone had glued the structure in the hour when honesty sleeps, had braced and slicked and clamped the seam the way a man might button a shirt over a wound when guests are due, had pushed a crowbar, where a crowbar should not go, and afterward had tried to make the wood forget. Behind that sequence walked a plain, difficult thought. It might have been done while Caleb was still somewhere, in that private forest of supports and shafts and maintenance. Wells, still holding up what could not be held, still breathing the old dust that makes lungs wise and weak at the same time. The idea stood between them and asked to be noticed. No one blinked. Reed's contradictions began to breed like reflections in a hall of mirrors. He said he left early, then said he returned for a clipboard, then said the clipboard had been in the office all along, then said the office had been locked, then remembered a set of spare keys he might have borrowed. The coin performed its bright nervous dance and sometimes stopped, as if the hand that moved it did not know where to send its guilt. June wrote times in a column and then drew a quiet bracket as if to hold the column upright. Sienna held the matchbook without opening it, because some doors are not for hands. The night thinned toward morning while they stood inside it and gave it weight. Dust lay on their shoulders like a gentle order to speak softly. The gym made small, settling sounds the way houses do when they are keeping secrets and deciding whether to be tired of keeping them. Lila set the ring marked MDX beside the fax with its 632, and the word urgent, and looked at the distance between those two objects as if it were measurable the way a hallway is, as if they could walk it and count doors. When she finally spoke, the sentence took the temperature down another degree. This was done in a hurry, she said, and the hurry had reasons. No one argued. It was not yet a charge. It was a shape. It was not yet proof. It was a path. The story they were building had beams and braces and a roofline that already cast a shadow. It did not have, not yet, a body or the kind of confession that makes juries nod. But it had glue where glue should not be, and a morning order that asked the sun to keep a secret, and a stain the color of time, and a ring that used to be a circle, and no longer was. They stood in a circle that did not touch and watched Reed watch the floor. The coin slipped, skittered, stopped against the toe of his shoe. The silence that followed had the weight of a beam. Lila lifted the ring with the care one lends to a thing that has been harmed by being misunderstood and set it back on the cloth. Then turned to Reed as if the rest of the room had stepped away and left them in a small clearing cut out of wood and shadow. Who glues wood where courage should be? She asked, and then, because there are questions that deserve the dignity of darkness, she switched off the lantern, and the building finished the sentence by breathing. Morning came with the cool taste of metal before the sun, and the gym felt like a ship in dry dock, every plank named, every seam considered, the room waiting with a patience that felt like faith. Old drawings spread across a table that smelled of pencil and wax, revealing the hidden anatomy of the place-thin service corridors like nerves, square maintenance wells, vents that carried air the way a rumor carries hope. Lines crossed until a secret version of the building lay there. Lila spoke seldom, but her pencil kept time. She circled the east side and wrote 17B without drama. Rory tapped the paper and said there used to be a trapdoor here, and June, who believes maps apologize until they match the ground, walked with him to the spot where grain crosses grain and a dull hinge gives away its small pride. When the hatch rose, the air cooled a degree and dust stirred with the relief of long-held breath. Below, the building wore its honest face, cinder block, strapped iron, a corridor narrow as a vow.sin. A stood with her hands at her heart. She said what she had not said before, because sometimes the right moment arrives only after silence invites it. Caleb's shirt, she said, was always impeccable. He ironed at night like some people pray, the steam a small weather, the creases a map for the day, and if a thread lifted, he fixed it with a red strip of tape until he could mend it proper. He carried a quiet fear of leaving things out of place. In him it turned into kindness, because order was how he made room for others. The memory put a warm varnish on the cold air below. June returned with paper old enough to tell the truth. She laid out requisitions that had survived in different cabinets. Emergency, one said. Before 0700, said another. East bleachers, replacement boards, expedite. Rush little voices that all meant fear, and beneath them the big quiet word universities love. Image, followed by event and message. The pages smelled faintly of toner and dust. Lila read them once, then placed them beside the shirt's dust, the bent ring, and a photograph of the seam that shone where wood should not. A crooked mercy arrived when someone rolled in a television and played a training video from the early 90s, square voice and apologetic drawings. The narrator pronounced bleacher like an elegant ant and pointed arrows that wandered. A small laugh escaped, not at the hurt but at the era, a bubble of air rising through deep water. Then the screen went dark and the room remembered itself. The shadow that had followed them took on a body. Not a dramatic collapse, but a give at the seam. A frantic bracing with epoxy and wire and prayer to keep wood from teaching physics to a crowd. Decisions by men who tried to stand between harm and headlines and discovered that standing there demands a debt some do not know how to pay. Fix it before the day knows, the papers whispered, as if the sun could be fooled by quick signatures. The words did not accuse, but they joined. The shape around that night began to look like a doorway. Rory spoke into the hush. I tried to hold, he said, his palm turned up as if it still carried weight. I called who I thought could help. I believed we could keep people safe and then do it right when the sun came up. He did not defend himself. He offered himself the way. A beam offers its shoulder. There is a place, he said, where right and wrong share a bridge, and sometimes a man steps wrong because the wind is loud. His keys chimed once, and the sound seemed to ask to be forgiven. They went out to Waller Creek. Because the map wanted them to, because air becomes explanation when water is near. The creek moved with late summer pride, carrying brightness in pieces and the smell of algae and mud. June read a memo about runoff channels and drainage that fed the creek from under the athletic complex, lines that made their quiet deliveries. When the sky was loud, Lila watched the gentle pull and thought how things travel through darkness and arrive looking like they always belonged. Sienna watched the light break on the moving skin and said nothing to Dot back in the gym. The smell of resin felt closer. Lila stacked the requisitions and signed them into evidence with letters that did not pretend to be anything else. From her pocket, she took a small roll of blue painter's tape and traced the underfloor route like a path for a parade of ghosts. Hatch, brace, seam, 17B. Sienna followed the line with her eyes. Dominic arrived and left and arrived again, wearing restlessness like a pressed shirt. Reed lingered in thresholds as if doorways could give alibis. The building, which had coached 1,000 small triumphs, now coached patience. June, who trusts light the way some trust scripture, said there is another way to read what wood keeps. She borrowed a desk lamp with a shade and a stubborn clamp, and she explained, not like a lecture but like a story told at the end of a shift, that sidelight coaxes relief out of flatness. That shallow inscriptions sleep through glare but wake when light moves along them like a low tide over stones. Wood is a diary that refuses to be hurried, she said. You do not make it speak. You make it comfortable enough to remember. Before the lamp, there was the bookkeeping of courage. Lila read aloud the phrases that had been pretending to be instructions and let them hear themselves. Emergency. Before 0700. Urgent repair. East bleachers. She set each word on the table with the shirt's dust and the ring's bend and the creek's patient whisper. She did not say cover-up. She did not need to. The geometry had taught itself. If a structure was glued in the dark, it was because someone needed the sun to see only the promise and not the sin. Sienna added a pebble of memory. He once came back because a sugar packet tore wrong and left grains where the spoon should be. He apologized to the spoon, laughed, wiped the sweetness with his sleeve and said, now the day can begin. We all have our altars, she said. His was any place where order made kindness possible. Evening tilted toward honey, and they carried the lamp under the east side where dust remakes the weather and words change their minds. June fastened the clamp to a brace that pretended indifference and angled the shade until the glow slid sideways across the seam at 17B, slow as a fingertip, tender as a hand that has learned to ask before touching. The beam traveled, paused, traveled again, and the wood began to answer in micro shadows and soft ridges, tiny hesitations where the grain lifted like a breath taken after holding too long. They leaned closer, and something that had been sleeping in the wood turned toward the light, as if words were tired of being buried and were practicing their mouths. The glow held steady, warm, and patient, and along the pale seam under 17B faint lines started to rise from the grain almost nothing. Everything, the first strokes of a message preparing how to be seen. The lamp held its warm breath and let the light go sideways, a patient tide across the seam beneath 17B and the wood, which had been polite through years of gains and knees and winter coats, began to offer back what it had kept, the grain first. Then the shallow interruptions no glare could show, the slow raising of strokes like reeds in low water, and then the lines themselves, 4 of them, not scratched in anger but carved in the small script of someone who knew time had turned brittle, and was still trying to write gently on it, "Don't arrest Rory." He tried. The wood gave way, and I held as long as I could. Tell my mother I heard the crowd till the end. CM 11:19p.m. No one spoke. The lamp hummed. Dust moved in the beam like ideas finally finding verbs. Sienna pressed her lips and breathed as if trying not to frighten a bird from her palm. Rory's keys did not chime. June, who believed in ink but loved confession more, traced each letter in the air without touching the wood, the way you trace a name on a grave when you want the stone to feel accompanied. Lila bowed her head the way some people do at doorways, not out of superstition but respect, and then she said, softly, that the wood had written a witness statement and they would treat it with the law's patience and the heart's. The night from long ago came back in a rope of minutes. Caleb hearing the hollow under the east bleachers and going down to find the seam that sang because it held air. The first tap that told him the joint had forgotten its promise, the hand to the radio. The new angle of his shoulders when he realized how many lives the plank above him carried. The way he held with his whole body while the crowd filed out. His breath quieting so theirs could remain ordinary. Rory hearing something wrong, not with his ears but the thin bones in his hands, sliding under the bleachers, seeing the tilt, dropping tools that would only slow him. Adding his weight and his will to Caleb's. The little words men say when they are not sure they can move the world and decide to try anyway there. There, hold, I've got it, I've got you. That's it, just until the last of them pass. The minute in which fear stopped being private and learned the color of responsibility. And then the choice that invited the morning to lie for them. Rory running for help because 2 were not enough. Coach Reed answering because authority likes the sound of its name. The first look that skirted the truth because the truth, if spoken out loud, would have sent ushers into the aisles and scattered 100 brittle ankles. Reed's voice telling them to keep it steady, to brace and glue, and promise themselves a better repair at dawn to make it presentable for the sun. A tub of 2-part epoxy opened with hands that shook and learned steadiness from fear. Wire pulled tight, clamps finding teeth. The odor of chemicals taking the place of courage for a while. A crowbar biting hard where it had no right, because sometimes the right tool becomes the wrong answer when asked the wrong question. A signature sketched in the head, already imagining the requisition. A sentence rehearsed urgent repair. Nothing to worry the public, because reputations like to arrive before facts. They worked until the clock earned its own heartbeat. And then someone went to fetch something else, more brace, more hands, more approval, and when they returned to give the night back what they had borrowed from it, Caleb was gone from the wedge where he had been holding the world. He had slipped into a narrow maintenance shaft that connected, the way old bones of buildings do, to a service corridor disused since the last renovation, the one with a lip just high enough to turn a foot into a fact. He did not fall far, but He fell exactly enough to pass into a hallway the maps had stopped drawing, and then into the low run that leads, when the rains come, to the drainage that leads to the creek, and the water that does what water does: carry, soften, claim, and return nothing but its own moving skin. Later storms finished what panic began. That is how a city can love a boy and not find him. The lamp's glow warmed the words one more time, and June, whose ink had waited almost 2 decades for this, wrote them in her notebook as they were, no paraphrase pretending to be improvement. Lila set a ruler beneath the lines, measured depths, angles, the way a doctor might measure a scar to know a wound's age, and she marked a quiet 11:19 beside her 6:32 facts because some twins are born of the same night, the carving that asked mercy for Rory, the morning order that asked daylight to offer mercy to a story that did not deserve it. News does its own running. Reed did not run because men who trust posture never think their legs will be needed. He stood in a room with walls that had never before been interested in him and learned how charges are spoken: obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, false statements pressed like thumbprints into the record. His coin now a small moon with no orbit, his fingers finally empty. Rory faced his own words printed in careful type, omission and endangerment, and he did not argue. He told a judge what he had told the wood with his hands: that he tried, that he feared a collapse that would kill more than one, that he believed. Keeping a crowd safe for a few minutes while they figured out how to do it right by daylight was what a man with keys should do. That in believing that he chose a wrong that let a worse wrong happen in the dark, and that he would carry it without asking to be lighter. The judge read the 4 carved lines aloud in chambers because sometimes the law needs help remembering why it exists, and the final sentences bent under the weight and then straightened punishment measured against attempt, against remorse, against a town's understanding that culpability is a word with fingers on both sides of the door. The university sent letters on heavy paper. The gym received new bolts that had learned humility. SIENA stood where the shirt lay, in its careful box, and touched the matchbook to the cloth as if the two were magnets reunited. The little cream rectangle with its tidy hinge and the blue that had once been the color of a clear noon. She said his name without the shape of grief, only the shape of someone lowering a flag with 2 hands. June wrote what she always meant to write, an essay that began with the sentence, "Some would sing because they keep air, and some sing because they kept a secret too long," and she called it "On Timber That Sings." And first years read it in orientation and put their palms on the railings of every old staircase without being told why. Lila closed her notebook, the elastic making its quiet thrum, and for once she let her coffee go cold and drank it anyway without apology. Because some victories are not warm. Students return to seats and midterms and to the understanding that buildings are like people, strong because someone tended them, safe because someone stayed late, fallible because fear is fast. The old pecan grove received a new custom. Between 17A and 17C, the university left a seat without number, a narrow absence dressed in varnish. On nights when the crowd rises at once and the sound climbs the rafters like a second team no one paid. For some swear that the wood breathes along, even rise like a sleeping animal glad to have its lungs back. And if you place your fingers under the lip at the old seam, you can feel a faint thrum the way you feel your own pulse under the jaw. Not a haunting but a thank you, not a voice but what a voice leaves behind. Rory still carries keys that announce him. When he walks past the east bleachers he slows, not to punish himself, but to be exact with the world. And he has a way now of checking a brace with 2 fingers and a breath. A ritual that looks like prayer because it is. Reed visits offices where nobody turns to him for answers, and if he keeps the coin, it stays in a drawer that does not rattle. Dominic tells a different joke more often. The punchline now is patience. Sienna stacks matchbooks for the new kids, who drink coffee too quickly, and writes inside them in a tiny hand, "Keep your kindness labeled." It does not get lost that way. June sometimes pauses under the bleachers and runs the lamp again, not to prove anything, just to remember how light behaves when it is given a task. The creek moves on, brown-green and honest, taking leaves, returning. Dragonflies making things simple that should not have been complicated. The shirt rests. The badge keeps its dull shine. The letters keep the size they chose the night they were carved. Not grand, not timid, sufficient. On certain evenings, when the sound lays itself over the court like a quilt and the knees of the bleachers know their work. When strangers sit where friends used to and find they care just as much, the gym becomes exactly what it was made to be. Nothing more and finally nothing less. And in that exactness you can hear if you want to, and even if you don't want to. You can feel that there are truths that will not be forced, truths that only consent to be read with the right light, truths that wait, patient as timber, until a hand brings the lamp near and a city remembers how to listen with its hand.